Greetings, viewers around the world. Long before the presidential election was called on Tuesday, November 8th, or actually it was the early morning hours of Wednesday, November 9th, 2016, it was announced that the Republican Party had retained control of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And the House was never in doubt. As the election approached, virtually nobody, thought that the Democrats would be able to control the House. The House would remain under Republican control. And what that meant was that basically all of the promises made by candidate Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail would have come to nothing. None of them would have been fulfilled, because we live in a time when there is no longer any such thing as bipartisanship. Many years ago, there used to find Democrats and Republicans on both sides of major issues. That began to die somewhere along about the Bush era, but by the time the President Obama came into office in early 2009, he had a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress, and with that Democratic majority, with Democrat-only votes, he was able to pass the stimulus program, which provided public works projects throughout the United States and allowed people to work and got some money circulating through the economy. And he was also able to have Congress pass and sign the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which was actually the first law that he signed, which modified federal discrimination law to provide greater protection for people who are discriminated against for various reasons by modifying the time in which they had to file lawsuits. So that was a very important piece of legislation. And also what he likes to call his signature achievement, Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act. And that stimulus program, if I remember correctly, was passed with only Republican votes. If there were any Republican votes, there weren't very many. It was hugely unpopular, and I remember the reaction of John Boehner, who was the House Minority Leader at that time, when the stimulus bill hit Congress. And he said, "Oh my God," and there were no way that Republicans were going to pass that bill. But with a Democratic majority, he did get the stimulus bill through, and ultimately, after more than a year of wrangling, he did get the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, through both houses of the U.S. Congress. But here's the thing. With Obamacare, it was a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, and virtually all of the votes, well, not virtually, but every single one of the votes for the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare were Democratic votes. Not one single Republican in either house voted for the Affordable Care Act when it went to floor votes in the U.S. Congress. And there we have the beginning. Maybe it's not the beginning. Maybe the beginning was actually some years before. But by this time, it is becoming obvious that bipartisanship is dead. That Democrats vote with Democrats and Republicans vote with Republicans, and there's very little that they ever cooperate on. So, in the 2010 election, Republicans captured control of the U.S. House. That meant that Obama's legislative achievements were basically at an end. Beginning in January of 2011 and moving forward, there is almost nothing of significance to most people that ever got through the U.S. Congress, because Obama was a Democrat and the House had a Republican majority, and the House was not going to vote for anything that Obama wanted, because he was a Democratic president and they wanted him to lose his office. They wanted him out of office. They wanted him to fail. Some of them said as much, that they wanted Obama to fail, and so they refused to pass anything. Now, they did reach some deals on raising the debt ceiling a few times, because if they hadn't done that, the country would have gone into default, and the consequences would have been enormous. They would have been horrible, and so they did reach some deals there, and in those cases, some Republicans crossed over to vote with Democrats in the House. But that was only because the consequences would have been so severe that the Republicans and their constituents would have suffered tremendously, and those Republicans would have paid a price. And so that was one instant where it was absolutely necessary that they did work together in order to avoid sending the country into Great Depression too. They did do that. But in the 6 years left of Obama's term, very little ever got through the U.S. Congress. Almost everything of significance that Obama did was by means of an executive order, because he couldn't get legislation through there. And that's the reason that after the massacre in Sandy Hook, where all those school children and some teachers, I think, died, that's the reason gun control legislation went absolutely nowhere at that time, because the Republican House of Representatives was not going to pass this proposal by a Democratic president. And so it has remained since January 2011. Except for things that have been done by the Federal Reserve, the U.S. economy has basically been on autopilot. Nothing getting through Congress. Okay, you get to 2016, and Hillary Clinton is the Democratic candidate, but the Democrats don't have a snowball's chance in hell of capturing the House, and this has been known all year. As a matter of fact, it was pretty much known last year. So, had Hillary been elected, you would have total gridlock, as has happened in the last 6 years of Obama administration. You would have nothing of consequence getting through Congress. You would have very little getting done at all. And if there was an economic downturn, the Clinton administration, had there been one, would have been absolutely paralyzed. They wouldn't have been able to do one blasted thing. With a Republican majority in the House, they wouldn't have been able to even get extended unemployments through. So, with a Hillary Clinton administration, because of that Republican majority in the House, and as it turned out in the U.S. Senate, you would possibly have had the least accomplished administration since John Tyler or someone in that nature. Wouldn't have accomplished much at all. And God forbid some horrible economic crisis had come along, because you wouldn't get any cooperation. The President and the Republican House, the Republican Senate wouldn't have been able to get anything done. You would have had at least 4 years of basically nothing being done about anything. And that would have largely spelled the end of the progressive movement for a long time to come, because political parties do not dump incumbent presidents. That just doesn't happen. I mean, even the Republican Party renominated Herbert Hoover in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression. Parties do not dump incumbent presidents. So what does that, where would that leave things in 2020? It would have left Hillary Clinton, the crippled, lame duck president, running for office again against a Republican candidate. And who would that have been? Possibly Rand Paul or Ted Cruz or Rick Perry or some similar person. And what kind of choice would that have been? The only way to punish Hillary for not getting anything done would have been to elect a Republican. So with a Hillary Clinton victory, you were looking at the death of progressivism for probably 8 years, no matter what happened. No matter whether she got reelected in 4 years or not, there would be no progressivism. There would be no liberalism. It just wouldn't have happened for 8 years. Because in 4 years you would have had either a Republican president, probably an extremist, or you would have had Hillary and a Republican Congress again. And why the hell anybody thought that was acceptable, I don't know. A deadlocked president and Congress getting nothing done. That's a great way to solve some problems, isn't it? No, I don't think so at all. Well, Hillary didn't win. And so now Donald Trump moves into the White House with a Republican majority in both houses of Congress, which is a tremendous opportunity for failure, the final failure of anything that resembles traditional conservatism, the conservative movement as it has existed since 1980. And here are two tremendous opportunities for a Republican failure, for a tremendous failure of Donald Trump's administration. tax cuts and deregulation. Because what we've learned over the decades now is that tax cuts and deregulation don't produce very many jobs, or they don't produce good jobs. And jobs always seem to be an issue in the United States. It's the issue that never, ever goes away. Never, ever, ever. It just never goes away. And when George Bush took office in 2001, he managed to get Congress to pass the biggest tax cuts in American history. And the recovery that followed was extremely lackluster recovery with all kinds of low-wage, unstable jobs. It wasn't a good recovery at all, and yet the George W. Bush administration sort of advocated Reaganomics to the max. But it failed. You had a lackluster recovery, and then you had the worst economic crisis since the Depression. So tax cuts and deregulation present a tremendous opportunity for Trump to possibly fail, and fail badly. So what happens then? Well, what happens then is if the Trump administration fails and the Clintons are out of the picture, that opens the door for a rather radical progressive candidate and pulling the Democratic Party possibly further to the left. I don't think Bernie Sanders will run again because he's getting up there in years, but a Sanders-like candidate could run and could win in 2020 if a Trump administration fails. That would not have been possible under the scenario I just explained if Hillary Clinton had won. If Hillary had won, you'd be stuck either with her or probably some right-wing nut job like Ted Cruz. But if the Trump administration fails, then, and Clinton is gone, now the Democratic Party is wide open for a fully progressive candidate. Now, who would that be? There's nobody in the picture right now because the entire Democratic establishment was on the Hillary train. And who the hell wants that? And so they will have a challenge. Somebody's going to have to come out of nowhere, kind of like Sanders did, but if this proves to be sort of the final failure of conservatism, then expect a big shift to the left to actually be possible in the United States. Expect the possibility of a Sanders-like candidate to possibly get nominated and probably win in 2020. And that is only possible because Hillary lost and won't be around to muck things up in the future. Her and Bill will be history. And, the door's wide open for a progressive candidate. So in that sense, what happened on Election Day in 2016 is probably the best thing that could have happened to the progressive movement, because now 2020 is wide open with possibilities. The tax cuts and deregulation scheme of the Trump administration, that has a very good chance of failing badly. And when it does, then here comes progressivism, and I don't know who that candidate would be. I have no idea who it would be, but I do know that a candidate with really radical proposals could possibly rally his party behind him and win in 2020, and that was made possible by Hillary's loss and Trump's ascendancy this year. That's actually pretty simple, so you think about that. Because what that means is that things are not nearly as bad as they seem if you take the time to think that through. If none of that was clear, play this back and think it through. Thank you, and have a good day.